Harold Jensen had learned something most people never figure out. The cold doesn't kill you all at once. It takes you piece by piece. First, your fingers go numb, then your toes. Then your thoughts start moving slower, like honey in January, and by the time you realize you're in trouble, you're already too far gone to do anything about it. He was 73 years old, and he'd been watching the cold his whole life. This morning, like every morning for the past 47 years, Harold woke before dawn in the tiny cabin he'd built with his own hands when he was 26 and foolish enough to think Alaska would be kind to him. The cabin sat 11 miles outside Fairbanks at the end of a dirt road that the county had stopped maintaining sometime during the Reagan administration. No one came out this way unless they were lost or looking for trouble, and Harold preferred it that way. He eased out of bed slowly, careful not to wake Mabel. She needed her sleep more than he did these days. Her arthritis had gotten worse since September, and the cold made everything harder for her. Getting up, getting dressed, getting through another day in a place that seemed determined to freeze them out. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he crossed to the wood stove. The fire had burned down to embers overnight, and his breath came out in small white clouds as he knelt to add kindling. They were rationing wood this year. Had to. The price of cordwood had gone up 40% since last winter, and their Social Security checks hadn't gone up at all. Harold had done the math 3 times, sitting at the kitchen table with a pencil stub and the back of an envelope. If they burned wood at the rate they'd burned it last year, they'd run out by February. If they cut back, if they kept the cabin just warm enough to survive, not warm enough to be comfortable, they might make it to March. March felt like a lifetime away. He got the fire going, then filled the kettle from the water bucket by the door. The bucket had a thin skin of ice on top, even though it sat inside the cabin. That was new. Last year, the inside water hadn't started freezing until December. The old weather radio on the shelf crackled with static as Harold turned the dial, searching for the morning forecast. The voice that came through was tinny and distant, like someone calling from another world, expecting temperatures to drop significantly over the next 2 weeks. The National Weather Service has issued a winter storm watch for interior Alaska. Residents are advised to check heating systems and stock emergency supplies. Overnight lows may reach 40 below zero. Harold turned off the radio. He'd heard enough. Behind him, the bedroom door opened, and Mabel shuffled out in her bathrobe and wool socks, 3 pairs of wool socks, because her feet never seemed to get warm anymore. She was 71 years old. With white hair she still pinned up every morning and blue eyes that hadn't lost their sharpness even if her body was slowly giving out. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad enough." She nodded and moved to the stove to warm her hands. They'd been married for 52 years, and they'd long since stopped needing many words to understand each other. Harold poured hot water into 2 cups, adding the last of the instant coffee, another thing they were rationing. "I've been thinking," Harold said, settling into his chair at the table. "That's usually trouble. I've been thinking about the cabin, about what we can do to make it hold heat better." Mabel wrapped her hands around her cup, absorbing the warmth. "We've caulked every crack, stuffed rags in every gap, put plastic over the windows. What else is there?" Harold was quiet for a moment. He'd been turning an idea over in his mind for weeks now. Something he'd read about years ago in a book about old Scandinavian building techniques. Something his father had mentioned once, back when Harold was a boy in Minnesota, before the family moved north chasing work that never quite materialized. "A second wall," he said finally. Mabel looked at him over the rim of her cup. "A what?" "A second wall. Built around the outside of the cabin, maybe 8 inches out from the logs. Pack the space between with hay and moss. Dead air, that's the secret. Dead air doesn't move, doesn't carry heat away. Like a thermos, but for a house." "Harold, we can barely afford firewood. Where are we going to get materials for another wall?" "I've got lumber stacked in the shed. Salvage wood I've been collecting for years. And there's plenty of hay in the old Miller barn. They abandoned that place 3 years ago, and no one's touched it since. Moss I can gather from the woods." Mabel set down her cup. "You're serious. We're not going to make it through this winter the way things are. You know it, and I know it. The wood won't last, the cabin's too drafty. Every year it gets a little harder, and this year, he shook his head. This year feels different, feels like the cold's got something to prove. She was quiet for a long moment, studying him with those sharp blue eyes that had seen him through every hardship they'd ever faced. The year the pipeline work dried up, the year they lost the baby. The only baby they'd ever conceived, 3 months before she was due. The year Harold's heart gave out, and the doctors said he'd never work again. Through all of it, Mabel had looked at him the same way, measuring, assessing, deciding whether to believe. How long would it take? She asked. If I work every day the weather allows, 2 weeks, maybe 3, and you think it'll help? I think it's our best chance. Mabel nodded slowly. Then, I guess you'd better get started. Before you continue listening, I'd love to know where in the world you're joining me from today. Drop a comment below. I read every single one. Now, back to Harold and Mabel. The settlement of Ridge Creek wasn't much to look at. A general store that doubled as a post office. A gas station that charged prices nobody could afford. A community center that hosted bingo on Tuesday nights and church services on Sunday mornings. Maybe 40 families scattered across the surrounding hills and valleys, most of them living in cabins, not much bigger than the Jensenses. Harold drove his old pickup into town that first morning, the engine complaining about the cold the whole way. He needed nails, his salvage wood was full of them, but most were rusted or bent beyond use. The general store had what he needed, if he could afford it. The bell over the door jingled as he walked in, stamping snow off his boots. Martha Dalton looked up from behind the counter, her face arranging itself into the particular expression Ridge Creek reserved for Harold Jensen. Part pity, part dismissal, like he was a stray dog that kept showing up no matter how many times you shooed it away. Morning, Harold. Cold one today. Getting colder. He made his way to the hardware section, such as it was, a single aisle of tools, nails, and odds and ends that hadn't changed since the store opened in 1974. He found the box of nails he needed and brought it to the counter, along with a roll of tar paper that had seen better days. Martha rang him up without comment, but as he counted out the bills, carefully, because every dollar mattered, the door jingled again and Carl Hendricks walked in. Carl was 45 years old, built like a refrigerator, and convinced he was the smartest man in Ridge Creek. He'd inherited his father's property 10 years ago and had been living off the rental income from 2 small cabins ever since. Never worked a real day in his life, as far as Harold could tell, but he talked like he'd built the whole valley with his bare hands. Well, Harold Jensen. Carl's voice carried that particular false friendliness that meant trouble was coming. Thought maybe you and Mabel had finally frozen solid out there. We were taking bets. Harold didn't respond. He pocketed his change and picked up his supplies. What's all that for? Carl nodded at the nails and tar paper. Don't tell me you're finally fixing that falling down shack of yours. Building project. Building project? Carl laughed, loud and theatrical. Harold, you can barely stand up straight. What are you building? A coffin. Martha looked uncomfortable behind the counter, but she didn't say anything. She never did. Something like that, Harold said, and walked out. He could hear Carl's laughter following him into the parking lot, and he could feel the eyes on his back. Martha's, Carl's, whoever else happened to be watching. He knew what they thought of him. The old man who wouldn't quit. The stubborn fool who should have moved to Anchorage years ago, where there were hospitals and heating assistance programs and people who would take care of him and Mabel whether they wanted care or not. But Harold Jensen had never asked anyone to take care of him. He'd worked pipeline construction for 30 years. He'd built his own cabin, dug his own well, hunted his own food when times were lean, and he wasn't about to start asking for help now. Not from people who looked at him like he was already dead. The work began the next morning. Harold started by clearing snow from around the cabin's foundation, working slowly because his back wouldn't let him work any other way. The cold bit at his face and hands, but he kept moving. That was the secret. Keep moving and the blood keeps flowing. Stop moving and the cold wins. Mabel watched from the window at first, her face creased with worry. But by mid-morning, she'd bundled herself up and come outside to help, holding boards steady while Harold measured and cut, handing him nails and tools when he needed them. "You shouldn't be out here," he told her. "Neither should you." They worked, in silence after that, the way they'd always worked best. The concept was simple, even if the execution was hard. Harold built a frame of salvage lumber around the existing cabin, standing posts about 8 inches out from the log walls. Between the posts, he nailed horizontal boards, creating a second exterior shell. The space between the two walls would be filled with insulation, hay and moss, dried leaves, anything that would trap air and keep it still. By the end of the first day, he'd completed one section of the frame, maybe 8 feet long and 6 feet high. His hands were raw from the cold, and his back felt like someone had driven a railroad spike through his lower spine. But when he stepped back and looked at what he'd built, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Word spread fast in Ridge Creek. By the third day, people were driving out to the Jensen place just to look. "What the hell is he doing?" asked Ray Morrison, standing at the edge of the property with his arms crossed. "Building a fence around his house. Looks like," said his wife Linda, "that's the dumbest thing I've ever seen." They watched for a few more minutes, then drove away, shaking their heads. Harold heard them, but he kept working. He'd heard worse. Carl Hendricks came out on the 5th day, bringing a couple of his drinking buddies from the bar in town. They parked their trucks at the end of the drive and walked up like they owned the place, their breath making clouds in the freezing air. "Jensen," Carl called out, "we came to see the show. What are you building? A fort? Expecting an invasion?" Harold was up on a ladder, nailing a board into place. He didn't look down. "It's an insulation barrier," he said. "Double wall, traps dead air between the layers, keeps the heat in." Carl exchanged glances with his friends. "Dead air? What kind of nonsense is that?" "Norwegian technique. Been used for hundreds of years in places colder than this." "Norwegian?" Carl burst out laughing. "Harold, you're not Norwegian. You're just an old man who doesn't know when to quit." He gestured at the half-finished structure. "Look at this thing. First real wind we get, it's going to blow apart. You'll be standing out here in your long johns trying to figure out where all your boards went." Mabel appeared in the doorway, her face tight with anger. "You can leave now, Carl." "Easy, Mabel. We're just trying to help." Trying to tell Harold here that he's wasting his time on a project that's not going to work. Carl's voice softened into something that was wasting, supposed to sound sympathetic but just sounded patronizing. "You two should think about that assisted living place down in Fairbanks. They've got heat, 3 meals a day, people to look after you when things get bad. Because, let me tell you, this winter's going to be bad, and this," he waved at the construction, "this isn't going to save you. We'll take our chances," Harold said, still not looking down. Carl shrugged. "Suit yourself. But don't come crying to us when you're freezing to death in your little Norwegian fort." They left laughing, their trucks kicking up snow as they turned around. Harold climbed down from the ladder, his jaw tight. Mabel came out and stood beside him. "Don't let them get to you," she said. "I'm not." But he was. Not because they were mocking him. He'd been mocked before and survived it. What bothered him was the certainty in their voices, the absolute conviction that he was wrong, that he was foolish, that his idea couldn't possibly work. What if they were right? He stood there for a long moment, looking at his half-finished project. The boards were weathered and mismatched, salvage from a dozen different sources. The frame wasn't perfectly straight. His hands weren't steady enough anymore for that kind of precision. In the harsh afternoon light, it looked exactly like what Carl had said, a fence around a house. A desperate gesture by a desperate old man. Mabel took his hand. Her fingers were cold through her wool gloves, but her grip was firm. "It's going to work," she said. "How do you know?" "Because you built it, and everything you've ever built has worked." Harold looked at her, at the woman who had stood beside him for 52 years, through every failure and every triumph, through every winter that tried to kill them. She believed in him. She always had. "I'd better get back to work," he said. "Lot more to do before the weather turns." The weather turned sooner than anyone expected. On the 8th day of Harold's project, the sky went from gray to black by noon. The wind picked up out of nowhere, screaming down from the mountains with a fury that rattled windows and sent loose objects tumbling across yards throughout Ridge Creek. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 2 hours. The first blizzard of the season had arrived. Harold was outside when it hit, nailing one of the final sections of the outer wall into place. Mabel had gone inside to start lunch, and he was alone when the wind suddenly changed direction and intensity, nearly knocking him off his ladder. He climbed down as fast as his body would allow, fighting against gusts that seemed determined to push him off his feet. Snow was already falling so thick he could barely see the cabin 10 feet away. He gathered his tools blindly, shoving them into the wooden box he'd built to hold them, then staggered toward the door. Inside, Mabel had the stove burning and the kettle on. She took one look at his snow-crusted face and guided him to the chair closest to the fire. "It's early," she said. "This shouldn't be happening yet. Weather doesn't care what should happen." Through the cabin's small windows, they watched the world disappear into white. The wind howled like something alive, clawing at the walls, searching for any gap or weakness. Harold found himself listening to the sounds of the cabin, the creak of logs, the whistle of air through cracks they'd never quite managed to seal, the constant background noise of winter trying to get in. But there was something else. Something different. The sections of the outer wall he'd finished, maybe 3/4 of the total structure, were blocking the worst of the wind on those sides of the cabin. He could hear the difference. On the finished sides, the walls barely groaned. On the unfinished side, where the original logs were still exposed to the elements, the noise was constant, a low, threatening sound like something being slowly torn apart. "Do you hear that?" he asked. Mabel nodded. "It's working. Not finished yet. Won't know for sure until it's done." "It's working," she repeated, more firmly this time. Harold looked at the door, at the small window beside it that showed nothing but swirling white. The unfinished section of the outer wall faced west, directly into the prevailing wind. Until he could complete it, they were still vulnerable, still exposed. But the blizzard was supposed to last 3 days, according to the last forecast he'd heard. 3 days of wind and snow and temperatures that could kill a man in minutes if he wasn't careful. "I need to finish it," he said. "Not in this. You'd die out there." He knew she was right, but he also knew that 3 days was a long time, and the cabin's weak point was exactly where the storm was strongest. They had firewood for now, but at the rate they'd have to burn it to compensate for the heat loss on the western wall, they'd use up their margin of safety before the blizzard ended. "I'll wait for a break in the wind," he said. "Storms like this usually have pauses, moments when it lets up. When that happens, I go out and work as fast as I can." "Harold, it's the only way, Mabel. You know it is." She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Then she nodded, slowly, the way she'd nodded at every dangerous decision he'd ever made. "I'll have hot coffee waiting," she said, "and dry clothes." They sat together as the blizzard raged outside, listening to the different sounds of the finished and unfinished walls, waiting for the storm to show them a moment of mercy. It would be a long 3 days. If Harold and Mabel's determination is already pulling at your heart, please hit that subscribe button and stay with me. The first break came 18 hours into the storm. Harold had been dozing in his chair by the stove, too wired to really sleep, but too exhausted to stay fully awake. Mabel had finally convinced him to rest after he'd spent hours pacing the cabin, checking windows, listening to the walls like a doctor listening to a patient's heartbeat. It was the silence that woke him. Not complete silence. The wind was still there, still pushing against the cabin, but it had dropped from a scream to a moan, and the snow had thinned enough that he could see the outline of trees through the window. He was on his feet before he was fully conscious, reaching for his coat. "Harold." Mabel's voice came from the bedroom doorway. She hadn't been sleeping either. "How long do you think you have?" "No way to know." Could be 10 minutes, could be an hour. Then you'd better move fast. He dressed in layers. Long underwear, wool shirt, canvas overalls, his heaviest coat, 2 pairs of gloves, the inner one's wool, the outer one's leather, a hat that pulled down over his ears, a scarf wrapped around his face until only his eyes showed. By the time he was done, he could barely move. But he knew from experience that mobility didn't matter as much as warmth when you were working in conditions like this. The door fought him when he tried to open it. Snow had drifted against the cabin during the storm, piling up in a bank that reached almost to his waist. He had to push with his shoulder, forcing the door open inch by inch, until there was just enough space to squeeze through. Outside, the world was unrecognizable. The snow had transformed everything into smooth white shapes, burying the woodpile, the tool shed, the chicken coop that hadn't held chickens in 15 years. The sky was the color of old pewter, low and heavy, pressing down on the landscape like a lid. And the cold was a physical presence, wrapping around him the moment he stepped outside, squeezing the warmth from his body with ruthless efficiency. Harold didn't waste time looking around. He waded through the snow toward the western wall of the cabin, where the unfinished section of his project stood naked against the elements. The damage wasn't as bad as he'd feared. The frame was still standing, the posts still anchored solidly in the ground, but several boards had been torn loose by the wind, and one whole section of the tar paper backing had ripped away, flapping uselessly in the gusts. He found his toolbox buried under a drift and dug it out with his gloved hands. His fingers were already going numb, but he ignored them. Time was the only thing that mattered now. The work was brutal. Every nail he drove felt like it took twice as long as it should. His hammer kept slipping in his gloved grip, and more than once he hit his thumb instead of the nail head, the pain muffled by cold and adrenaline. The wind picked up again while he worked, not back to full strength but strong enough to make every movement a battle. He got one board secured, then another, then a third. The tar paper was harder. His fingers wouldn't cooperate, wouldn't grip the material properly, and the wind kept catching it like a sail, trying to tear it from his hands. He finally managed to get it stretched across the frame and tacked down at the corners, but it was sloppy work, not up to his standards, not the kind of craftsmanship he'd prided himself on for 50 years. But it would hold. That was all that mattered. By the time he'd finished the most critical repairs, his body was screaming at him to stop. His back had seized up somewhere around the second board, and now every movement sent bolts of pain shooting down his legs. His face was numb where the scarf had slipped, and he couldn't feel his feet at all. But the wall was mostly complete now. Not perfect. He'd have to come back and finish the insulation layer, pack the space with hay and moss, but the structure was there. The wind was hitting the outer boards instead of the cabin logs, and even standing outside in the teeth of the storm, Harold could feel the difference. He made it back inside just as the wind picked up again, the brief calm already giving way to renewed fury. Mabel was waiting with hot coffee and a blanket warmed by the stove. She didn't say anything, didn't need to. She just guided him to his chair and started peeling off his frozen layers, her hands gentle but efficient, the hands of a woman who had done this 100 times before. "It's done?" she asked, mostly. "Need to pack the insulation still, but the frame's up, the barrier's in place." She nodded and pressed the warm cup into his shaking hands. They sat together as the storm raged on, listening to the walls. And now, for the first time, both sides of the cabin sounded the same. The deep, muffled quiet of wind hitting something and being turned away. The desperate whistling through cracks had stopped. The constant low moan of logs under pressure had faded to nothing. "It's warmer," Mabel said quietly. "Can you feel it? It's actually warmer." Harold could feel it. The stove was burning at the same rate it had been all day, but the cabin's temperature had climbed noticeably. The water bucket by the door, which had been growing a fresh skin of ice every few hours, was still liquid, and when he held his hand up near the western wall, the wall that had been bleeding heat for days, he felt nothing. No draft, no cold spot. Just stillness. "Dead air," he murmured. "What? That's what's in the gap now. Dead air." Doesn't move, doesn't conduct heat, just sits there, like a blanket wrapped around the whole cabin. Mabel smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her in weeks. A blanket you built. We built, he corrected. Couldn't have done it without you holding those boards. She reached over and took his hand, her fingers warming against his. They sat like that for a long time, two old people in a tiny cabin in the middle of nowhere, listening to the storm that couldn't quite reach them anymore. The blizzard lasted another 2 days. When it finally broke, Ridge Creek looked like it had been hit by a bomb made of snow. Drifts had swallowed cars up to their windows. The road into town was impassable. Power lines were down throughout the valley, and the few homes that relied on electric heat were already in trouble. Harold spent those 2 days finishing what he'd started. He packed the gap between the walls with hay he'd stockpiled from the Miller barn, stuffing it tight into every space until not a sliver of daylight showed through. He added layers of dried moss on top of the hay, nature's insulation, used by people in cold climates for thousands of years. He sealed the joints where the outer wall met the roof with a mixture of mud and sawdust that would freeze solid and stay that way until spring. By the time he was done, the cabin looked strange. There was no denying it. The outer wall added an awkward bulk to the structure, making it look like a cabin wearing an oversized coat. The mismatched boards and weathered lumber gave it a patchwork appearance, and the tar paper patches flapped slightly in the wind, creating a sound like distant applause. But inside, the transformation was undeniable. The morning after the blizzard ended, Harold woke to something he hadn't experienced in years: warmth. Real warmth. Not the desperate temporary heat that came from burning wood faster than you could afford, but a steady, comfortable temperature that seemed to wrap around him like an embrace. He checked the thermometer he kept nailed to the wall by the door. 58 degrees inside the cabin, and outside, according to the radio, it was 17 below zero. "Mabel," he called, "come look at this." She shuffled out from the bedroom, still in her nightgown, her breath not making clouds anymore because the air in the cabin was warm enough that breath stayed invisible. 58 degrees, Harold said, pointing at the thermometer. "And we burned less wood last night than we usually burn in 4 hours. Mabel stared at the thermometer like it was telling her she'd won the lottery. Then she looked at Harold, her eyes bright with something he hadn't seen in a long time. "You did it," she whispered. "The wall did it, the dead air, just like I told them it would. They're going to feel pretty foolish when they see this." Harold shook his head. "They're not going to see it. They're not going to come out here and admit they were wrong. That's not how people work." But he was wrong about that, because the blizzard was just the beginning, and what came next would change everything. Now, if you've been with me this far, I'm curious. Have you ever had a moment where everyone doubted you, but you trusted your instincts anyway? I'd love to hear your story in the comments. Let's continue. The week after the blizzard was what Alaskans called a breather, a period of relative calm between storms, when temperatures hover around zero and the sky goes that particular shade of blue that only exists in the far north. People dug out their vehicles, cleared their driveways, checked on neighbors. Nobody checked on the Jensens. Harold hadn't expected them to. He'd lived in Ridge Creek long enough to know how things worked. The community looked after its own, and the Jensens had never quite been considered part of that inner circle. They'd moved here from Minnesota 50 years ago, and in Ridge Creek terms, that made them newcomers, outsiders, people who hadn't earned the right to be worried about. It stung, but Harold had made his peace with it long ago. He had Mabel, he had his cabin, he had his pride. That was enough. The breather lasted 5 days. Then the radio started talking about what was coming next, and Harold felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. Unprecedented Arctic air mass moving down from the Beaufort Sea. Forecasters are calling this a generational cold event. Temperatures may drop to 50 below zero or colder. Wind chill values could reach 70 or 80 below. This is a life-threatening situation. All residents of interior Alaska are urged to take immediate precautions. Harold turned off the radio and looked at Mabel. 50 below, he said. I heard. Maybe colder. She nodded slowly. Will the wall hold? It was the question Harold had been asking himself since he'd heard the forecast. Everything he'd read about double wall construction suggested it would work. The principle was sound, the physics were solid. But theory and practice were different things, and he'd never tested his design against conditions this extreme. I don't know, he admitted. I think so, but I don't know for sure. Mabel absorbed this information with the calm practicality that had gotten her through 71 years of hard living. Then we'd better prepare for the worst and hope for the best. They spent the next 3 days getting ready. Harold brought in extra firewood, stacking it along the interior walls where it would stay dry and add another layer of insulation. Mabel cooked everything that might spoil and stored it in containers outside the door, where the cold would keep it frozen better than any refrigerator. They filled every container they had with water, knowing that if the temperature dropped as low as predicted, even the cabin's interior might not be safe from freezing. They checked on the insulation in the wall, making sure there were no gaps, no places where cold air might sneak through. Harold added extra hay to a few spots that seemed thin and reinforced the tar paper in places where the wind had loosened it during the blizzard. And then they waited. The cold snap hit on a Tuesday night. Harold was sitting by the stove, reading an old paperback western by lamplight when he felt it. A change in pressure, a subtle shift in the quality of the silence outside. He set down his book and went to the window. The sky was clear, so clear that the stars seemed close enough to touch, crowding together in dense clusters that blazed against the blackness. The aurora borealis was out, great curtains of green and purple light rippling across the horizon. It was beautiful, the kind of sight that made people travel thousands of miles to see. It was also deadly. Clear skies in Alaska mean no cloud cover. No cloud cover means nothing, holding in whatever heat the Earth has absorbed during the day. And in December, with the sun barely clearing the horizon for a few hours, there wasn't much heat to begin with. Harold checked the outside thermometer, the one he kept mounted on a post near the woodpile. The red line had dropped below the lowest mark on the scale. He went back inside and added wood to the stove. Then he woke Mabel. "It's happening," he said. "The cold's here." They sat together through that first night, not sleeping, barely talking, just listening to the cabin around them. The walls creaked as the wood contracted in the cold, a sound Harold knew well, had heard every winter for 47 years. But tonight, the creaking came only from the inner walls, the original logs. The outer wall, his wall, was silent. By midnight, the cold had intensified to the point where Harold could hear a strange, high-pitched keening sound, the sound of air itself seeming to protest the temperature. The fire in the stove burned fiercely, consuming wood at a rate that would have terrified him a month ago. But inside the cabin, the temperature held steady. 54 degrees, not warm by most standards, but warm enough, survivable, safe. "It's holding," Mabel said, her voice hushed with something like wonder. "Harold, it's holding." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak, because he could feel it now, the truth of what he'd built. The outer wall was taking the worst of the cold, absorbing it, stopping it before it could reach the cabin itself. The dead air in the gap was doing exactly what he'd promised, acting as a barrier, a buffer, an invisible shield against the deadly temperature outside. They made it through that first night, and the second, and the third. On the fourth morning of the cold snap, Harold heard something he hadn't heard in years. A vehicle on his driveway. He went to the window and saw a pickup truck struggling through the snow, its headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Behind it came another truck, then another. By the time the first vehicle reached the cabin, there were 5 trucks in a line, their exhaust plumes rising white against the black sky. Harold pulled on his coat and stepped outside, squinting against the cold that immediately attacked his exposed skin. The first person out of the first truck was Carl Hendricks. He looked terrible. His face was raw and wind-burned, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. He was wrapped in every piece of clothing he seemed to own, layers upon layers that made him look twice his normal size, and he was shivering, a deep, uncontrollable shivering that came from cold that had gotten down into the bones and refused to leave. "Jensen," Carl said, his voice cracking. "Please, we need help." Behind him, car doors were opening. People were climbing out, men, women, children. Harold recognized faces from town, from the general store, from the community center, people who had laughed at him, people who had called him a fool, people who were freezing to death. "What happened?" Harold asked. Carl's face twisted with something that might have been shame. "The heating. Nothing's working. Furnaces can't keep up. Wood stoves aren't enough. The cold, it's getting inside everywhere, inside our walls, inside our clothes, inside our—" He broke off, coughing. "My kids are in the truck. They've been shivering for 2 days straight. I don't know what else to do." Harold looked past Carl to the other vehicles, where pale faces peered out through frosted windows. He saw Martha Dalton from the general store, her usually pinched expression replaced by naked fear. He saw Ray Morrison and his wife Linda, the same people who had driven out to mock his fence around a house. He saw families he didn't even know, people who must have heard about the crazy old man with the double wall and come out of pure desperation. The door opened behind him, and Mabel stepped out. She took one look at the crowd of freezing people and made the decision without saying a word. "Get them inside," she said. "All of them. Now." They came in waves, 15 people, then 20, then more. The cabin that had seemed too small for 2 people somehow absorbed them all, bodies pressing together for warmth, children sitting on parents' laps, strangers becoming intimates out of pure necessity. Mabel put water on to boil. Harold stoked the fire until it roared. People shed their outer layers and piled them in corners, making room for more bodies, more desperate souls fleeing the cold that had turned their own homes into tombs. And through it all, the cabin held. The temperature dropped a few degrees with the door constantly opening and closing, but it stabilized at 49. Still warm enough, still survivable. The double wall kept doing its job, blocking the wind, trapping the heat, turning Harold's tiny cabin into an island of warmth in a frozen sea. "How is this possible?" Martha Dalton asked, looking around at the walls that weren't covered in frost, the floor that wasn't slick with ice, the air that didn't burn when you breathed it. "How are you doing this?" Harold explained about the second wall, about the dead air, about the Norwegian techniques and the old knowledge that modern convenience had made everyone forget. People listened in silence, their faces shifting from disbelief to wonder to something that looked like shame. "We laughed at you," Carl said quietly, "when you were building it. We said it would never work. I remember. And now," Carl's voice broke, "now you're saving our lives." Harold looked at the man who had mocked him, at the faces of all the people who had dismissed him as a foolish old man who didn't know when to quit. He could have said something cutting, could have reminded them of every insult, every joke, every time they'd made him feel small and worthless. But Mabel caught his eye from across the room, and he saw in her face what she was thinking, what she was asking him to be. "The wall's not mine," Harold said finally. "It belongs to whoever needs it, always has." He spent the rest of that day teaching, explaining how the double wall worked, why the dead air mattered, where to find materials and how to put them together. People took notes on the backs of envelopes, on scraps of paper, on their own hands when nothing else was available. They asked questions, real questions, serious questions, and Harold answered every one. By nightfall, the cabin held 32 people, and the temperature outside had dropped to 53 below zero. Inside, warmed by bodies and fire and the wall that Harold Jensen had built when everyone said it couldn't be done, it was 41 degrees warmer than the frozen hell outside, and it stayed that way through the longest night any of them had ever known. The cabin breathed with 32 souls. Harold had never seen anything like it. His small home transformed into something between a refugee camp and a church sanctuary. Bodies were everywhere, arranged with the careful efficiency of people who understood that space meant survival. Children slept in piles like puppies, their small bodies generating heat that their parents gratefully absorbed. Couples sat with their backs against the walls, heads drooping with exhaustion but refusing to fully sleep. The elderly, and Harold noted with grim humor that he and Mabel were far from the oldest people present, had been given spots closest to the stove, where the warmth was strongest. Mabel moved through the crowd like she'd been hosting 30 people her entire life. She kept the kettle going, producing cup after cup of weak tea that she stretched with hot water when the leaves ran out. She found blankets where no blankets should have existed, pulling them from closets and chests that Harold had forgotten they owned. She settled arguments between children with a look and calmed, frightened mothers with a touch on the shoulder. She was magnificent. "You should rest," Harold told her around midnight, catching her arm as she passed with another armload of blankets. "So should you." "I'm serious, Mabel. My heart is fine." She looked at him with those sharp blue eyes, and he saw something in them he hadn't seen in years. Purpose, joy, life. "This is the most useful I've felt in a decade, Harold. Don't you dare try to take that from me." He let her go, watching her disappear into the crowd of people who needed her. And he understood suddenly what had been killing them both all these years. Not the cold, not the poverty, not the aching joints or the failing bodies. Loneliness. They'd been dying of loneliness, and they hadn't even known it. The first crisis came around 2 in the morning. Harold had been dozing in his chair when a commotion near the door jerked him awake. A man was trying to leave, one of the younger ones, maybe 30, with a wife and 2 small children huddled in the corner. "I have to check on the house," the man was saying, struggling against the hands trying to hold him back. "The pipes. If the pipes freeze—" "Your pipes are already frozen," Carl Hendricks said, his voice rough but firm. "They froze 12 hours ago, same as everyone else's. But my tools, my equipment, everything we own is in that house, and it'll still be there when this breaks. But you won't be if you go out in this." The man, Harold thought his name might be Peters, one of the families that had moved to Ridge Creek a few years back, looked around wildly. His eyes were too bright, his movements too jerky. Harold recognized the signs. Panic, the kind that came when a man felt helpless and couldn't stand it. Harold pushed himself up from his chair and made his way through the crowd. "Son," he said quietly, putting a hand on Peter's shoulder. "What's your name?" "David. David Peters." "David, look at me." Harold waited until the younger man's frantic eyes focused on his face. "I know what you're feeling right now. I know you want to do something, fix something. Make it right. That's what men do when their families are in danger." David nodded jerkily. "But the bravest thing you can do right now is nothing. Stay here. Keep your wife warm. Let your children sleep without seeing their father walk out into the cold and not come back." Harold squeezed his shoulder. "Your house will wait. Your family needs you now." The fight went out of David Peters like air from a punctured tire. His shoulders slumped, and when he turned back toward his family, Harold saw the tears he was trying to hide. Mabel appeared at Harold's elbow with a cup of tea. She pressed it into David's hands without a word, then guided him back to his wife and children. "That was good," Carl said quietly, coming to stand beside Harold. "What you said to him." Harold shrugged, said what needed saying. "How do you know how to stay calm, I mean, when everything's falling apart?" Harold considered the question. Outside, the wind had picked up again, screaming around the corners of the cabin with renewed fury. The outer wall groaned slightly, the first sound it had made all night, and Harold felt a flicker of concern before the groaning stopped. "Experience, I suppose," he said finally. "You live long enough, you learn that panic doesn't help anything. The cold doesn't care if you're scared, it just does what it does. All you can control is yourself." Carl was quiet for a moment. "I've been a fool, Jensen. We've all been fools at one time or another. No, I mean," Carl struggled with the words. "I looked at you and Mabel, and all I saw was 2 old people who should have given up years ago. I didn't see," he gestured around the cabin, "I didn't see this, what you built, who you are." Harold didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. They stood together in silence. Two men who had been something like enemies for 20 years, watching the cabin full of people who were surviving because one of them had refused to quit. If this story is touching something in you, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to the channel. Stories like Harold and Mabel's deserve to be heard, and your support helps me share them. Now, let's see what happens when dawn finally breaks. The second crisis came at 4 in the morning. A child, a little girl, maybe 6 years old, woke up crying that she couldn't breathe. Her mother's screams cut through the crowded cabin like a knife. And suddenly everyone was awake, everyone was moving, and Harold felt the old familiar fear clenching at his chest. Dr. Sarah Chen pushed through the crowd. Harold hadn't even known she was there, a physician from the clinic in town. She must have come with one of the later groups. She knelt beside the little girl and began her examination with calm, professional movements. "Asthma attack," she announced after a moment. "Does anyone have an inhaler? Any kind of bronchodilator?" Silence. In the rush to escape their freezing homes, people had grabbed children and blankets and whatever food was closest. Medical supplies hadn't made the list. "I have," a woman's voice came from near the back, "I have an old inhaler. It's expired, but get it." The expired inhaler helped, but not enough. The little girl, her name was Emma, Harold learned later, was still wheezing, still struggling, her lips taking on a bluish tinge that made Harold's stomach clench. "She needs a nebulizer, doctor," Chen said, her voice tight. "Or steroids, something to open her airways." "There's nothing," Emma's mother sobbed. "There's nothing here." Harold's mind raced through the contents of his cabin. Decades of accumulated supplies, tools, remedies. There had to be something. Then he remembered. "Mabel," he called out. "The cabinet above the sink, the jar with the dried leaves." Mabel found it and brought it over. "Doctor." Chen looked at the jar skeptically. "Mullein," Harold explained. "My grandmother used it for chest complaints. You steep it in boiling water and breathe the steam. That's folk medicine. It's what we have, doctor." Chen hesitated for only a moment. Then she nodded. "Get me boiling water," and a towel to make a tent over her head. They worked together, the physician and the old man with his grandmother's remedies. Mabel brought the kettle, and Harold showed Dr. Chen how to prepare the mullein the way his grandmother had taught him 60 years ago. They made a tent over Emma's head with a blanket and let her breathe the medicated steam. It wasn't a miracle. The little girl didn't suddenly bounce up, fully healed, but her breathing eased. The blue tinge faded from her lips, and when she finally fell asleep in her mother's arms, her chest rose and fell with something approaching normalcy. "Where did you learn that?" Dr. Chen asked Harold afterward, washing her hands in water that Mabel had heated on the stove. "My grandmother. She was a healer in the old way, herbs and roots and things people have forgotten. She came over from Norway when she was 16, brought all that knowledge with her, the double wall, the mullein. It's all from the same source?" Harold nodded. "Old ways. Things people figured out over centuries because they had to. Modern life made us forget." Dr. Chen looked around the cabin, at the walls that were keeping them all alive, at the jar of dried leaves that had helped a little girl breathe. "Maybe we shouldn't have forgotten," she said. The night crawled toward dawn. Harold moved through the cabin in slow circuits, checking on people, checking on the walls, checking on the fire that Mabel kept burning with the steady expertise of a woman who had been keeping fires alive for 50 years. The outer wall continued to hold, absorbing the worst of the cold, protecting them all with the simple physics of dead air and hay and moss. Around 5 in the morning, the wind dropped suddenly. The silence was almost shocking after hours of constant howling. Harold went to the window and looked out. The sky was still dark, but there was a quality to the darkness that suggested dawn wasn't far off. The aurora had faded, replaced by a scatter of stars that seemed to pulse with cold light. The thermometer outside read 58 below zero, 58 below. Harold had lived in Alaska for half a century, and he'd never seen it that cold. That was the kind of temperature that killed car batteries in minutes, that turned exposed skin to frostbite in seconds, that could crack trees like gunshots as the sap froze and expanded. and inside his cabin, surrounded by 31 other people, it was 41 degrees warmer. "Harold," Mabel's voice came from behind him. "Look." He turned. She was pointing at something near the far wall, a spot where the wallpaper had peeled away years ago, exposing the bare logs beneath. Normally, in cold like this, those logs would be rimed with frost on the inside, weeping moisture that froze as soon as it touched the wood. But the logs were dry, completely dry. The double wall was working so well that the cold wasn't even reaching the original structure anymore. "I'll be damned," Harold whispered. "I'd rather you weren't," Mabel said, smiling. "We've got too much to do." Dawn came slowly, the way it always did in December, a gradual lightening of the sky from black to gray to the pale blue of a winter morning. People stirred, stretched, began to remember where they were and why. The temperature outside hadn't changed. 58 below zero, according to the radio, but the sun was rising, and there was something about daylight that made even the worst situations feel more manageable. Martha Dalton was one of the first to fully wake. She sat up, looked around the crowded cabin, and seemed to see it clearly for the first time. "Harold," she said, "how are you feeding all these people?" It was a good question. Harold and Mabel had stocked up before the cold snap, but their supplies were meant for 2 people, not 32. They'd been stretching everything, the tea, the soup, the bread, but there was a limit to how far things could stretch. "We're managing," Harold said. "That's not what I asked." Before Harold could respond, Carl Hendrik spoke up from across the room. "I've got canned goods in my truck. Brought them when we came. Figured they'd be safer here than in my freezing house. Beans, corn, some soup." "I have bread," said another voice. Linda Morrison. "2 loaves plus some cheese. There's meat in my cooler." Someone else offered. "Moose steaks. They'll be frozen solid, but we can thaw them on the stove." Within minutes, people were pulling supplies from pockets, bags, truck beds, food they'd grabbed without thinking, provisions they'd almost forgotten they had. Mabel organized it all with quiet efficiency, creating an inventory, planning meals, making sure nothing was wasted. "We've got enough for 2 days," she announced. "Maybe 3 if we're careful." "The cold snap's supposed to break tomorrow night, Doctor," Chen said, checking her phone. "Cell service is spotty, but I got a forecast through. Temperatures rising to 15 below by Wednesday." 15 below. A week ago, that would have sounded miserable. Now it sounded like a heat wave. The day passed in a strange kind of rhythm. People took turns sleeping, eating, using the outhouse that Harold had built years ago, and that was now serving more people in a day than it usually served in a month. Children played quiet games in corners, supervised by whoever happened to be awake. Adults talked in low voices, sharing stories, comparing notes on the damage they'd fled. Harold spent most of the day answering questions about the double wall. How far out from the original structure? Ray Morrison wanted to know, taking notes on a piece of cardboard. "About 8 inches, far enough to create a good air gap, close enough to build easily. And the insulation, it has to be hay? Hay works. So does moss, dry leaves, straw, even crumpled newspaper. Anything that traps air. The key is making sure it's dry. Wet insulation doesn't insulate, it conducts cold." "What about vents?" "You mentioned vents, small ones, near the top of the wall. You need some air circulation or you get moisture buildup, and moisture leads to rot. But they should be small, just big enough to prevent condensation, not big enough to let cold air in." He drew diagrams on the backs of envelopes. He sketched designs on people's hands when they ran out of paper. He explained the physics over and over again, how air was actually a good insulator when you kept it from moving, how the enemy wasn't cold itself but heat loss, how a barrier didn't have to be thick to be effective if it was designed right. "You should write this down," Dr. Chen said, watching him explain the concept to a group of younger men. "Make it official. A guide that people could follow. I'm not a writer. You don't have to be. Just write what you know, what you've taught us today. That could save lives." Harold thought about it. All the knowledge he'd accumulated over 73 years, all the things his grandmother had taught him and his father had shown him, and he'd figured out for himself through decades of trial and error. It was all stored in his head, and when he died, it would die with him. Unless he wrote it down, maybe, he said, when this is over, maybe I will. The second night was easier than the first. People knew where they were sleeping, knew the rhythm of the cabin, knew each other in ways they hadn't before. The fear had faded, replaced by something that felt almost like camaraderie. Strangers who had never exchanged more than nods at the general store now shared blankets and stories and the last of the coffee. Harold sat by the stove, too tired to sleep, but too keyed up to relax. The fire crackled softly, and beyond the walls, the cold waited with patient malevolence. Mabel settled into the chair beside him, moving slowly. The past 2 days had taken a toll on her. He could see it in the shadows under her eyes, the way she held her left arm close to her body. But when he looked at her face, he saw the same thing he'd seen that first night. Purpose, joy, life. "We did it," she said softly. "We're going to make it through. Looks like it. I wasn't sure, you know. When you started building that wall, I believed in you. I always believe in you. But I wasn't sure it would work." Harold took her hand. Her fingers were warm, and that small fact felt like a miracle. "Neither was I. Not really." "Then why did you do it?" He thought about the question, thought about the long years of scraping by, of being dismissed, of watching the world change around them while they stayed stubbornly the same. "Because I had to do something," he said finally. "Because sitting still and waiting to die isn't living. Because even if it didn't work, at least I would have tried." Mabel squeezed his hand. "That's why I married you, Harold Jensen, 52 years ago, and I've never once regretted it." They sat together in silence, watching the fire burn, listening to the sounds of 30 other people breathing in their home. It was the best night of Harold's life. The cold broke on Wednesday afternoon, exactly when the forecast had predicted. Harold was outside, the first time he'd ventured out in 3 days, checking the condition of the double wall. The temperature had climbed to a mere 22 below zero, and after what they'd been through, it felt almost balmy. The wall had held beautifully. Some of the tar paper had torn loose in spots, and there were areas where the hay had settled and would need to be topped up, but the structure itself was sound. The boards were still tight, the posts still anchored, the barrier still intact. One by one, people began to leave. They emerged from the cabin, blinking in the daylight, their faces marked with exhaustion, but also something else: relief, gratitude, and for many of them, shame. Carl Hendricks was one of the last to go. He stood on the porch, looking at the double wall, shaking his head slowly. "I'm going to build one," he said, "soon as I can get materials, exactly like you showed me. I hope you do." "And Jensen," Carl hesitated, struggling with words that didn't come naturally to him. "I'm sorry for everything I said, everything I thought. You're a better man than I gave you credit for." Harold could have said something gracious, could have brushed off the apology, pretended the years of mockery hadn't hurt. Instead, he just nodded. "Build the wall, Carl. That's all the apology I need." As the last trucks pulled away down the snow-covered drive, Harold and Mabel stood on their porch, watching their neighbors return to their frozen homes. The valley was devastated. Pipes burst, roofs collapsed, trees shattered by the cold. It would take months to recover, and some families would never fully bounce back. But they were alive, all of them, because of a wall that everyone said couldn't work, built by an old man that everyone said should have given up. Harold put his arm around Mabel, and together they went back inside their warm, impossible cabin. They had work to do. The thaw came slowly, the way everything came slowly in interior Alaska. First, the temperature climbed back to single digits below zero, still cold enough to kill, but no longer the murderous deep freeze that had gripped the valley. Then it crept up to zero, then above, until by the second week of January, Ridge Creek was experiencing what passed for a warm spell, 15 degrees above zero, with actual sunshine breaking through the clouds. Harold spent those first weeks after the cold snap doing what he'd always done, working. He patched the spots where the double wall had been damaged, replacing torn tar paper and adding fresh hay to areas where the insulation had settled. He cleared snow from the roof and checked the integrity of every joint and seam. The wall had saved them all, but it wouldn't save anyone again if he let it fall into disrepair. What surprised him was that he wasn't working alone. Carl Hendricks showed up on the third day after the cold broke, his truck loaded with lumber he'd salvaged from a collapsed barn on his property. He didn't say much, just parked in Harold's driveway and started unloading boards. "What's this?" Harold asked, coming out to meet him. "Materials for repairs." And Carl hesitated. "I was hoping you might help me get started on my own wall. When you have time." Harold looked at the pile of lumber, then at Carl's face. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like humility. "I've got time now," Harold said. They worked together for 3 days, Harold teaching and Carl learning. The wall that went up around Carl's cabin wasn't as elegant as Harold's. The boards were rougher, the joints less precise, but it was sound. When they finished, Carl stood back and looked at what they'd built together. "It's not pretty," he said. "Pretty doesn't keep you warm." Carl nodded slowly. "Jensen, I've been thinking about everything that happened, about how you took us in even after—" He stopped, shook his head. "I don't know how to make it right." "You just did," Harold said. "You learned. You'll teach someone else. That's how it works." The requests started coming in the following week. Ray Morrison wanted help with his wall. So did the Peters family and the Chens. And a young couple named Kowalski who had just moved to the valley and nearly died in their poorly insulated rental cabin. Word spread beyond Ridge Creek, to Fairbanks, to the surrounding villages, to communities Harold had never heard of. An old man in the middle of nowhere had figured out how to survive the worst cold snap in living memory, and suddenly everyone wanted to know his secret. "We should charge them," Mabel said one evening, only half joking. "Consulting fees." Harold shook his head. "Can't put a price on survival. We can barely afford to survive ourselves." It was true. The cold snap had depleted their firewood supply faster than Harold had planned, and even with the double wall's efficiency, they'd need to restock before the next cold spell. Their savings, what little remained, wouldn't stretch far enough. But that problem solved itself in ways Harold never expected. The first gift appeared on their porch a week after Carl's wall was finished, a cord of seasoned firewood, stacked neatly beside the door. No note, no explanation, just wood. The second gift came 2 days later, a box of groceries, including coffee, real coffee, not the instant stuff they'd been stretching for months. Again, no note. By the end of January, the gifts had become a steady stream: firewood, food, a new wool blanket to replace the ones that had been worn thin from hosting 32 people, tools, medicine, a hand-knitted sweater for Mabel, made by someone with more skill than Harold could identify. "Who's doing this?" Mabel asked, holding up a jar of homemade preserves that had appeared overnight. "Everyone," Harold said. "No one wants to take credit, they just want to help." It was, he realized, exactly what he and Mabel had done during the cold snap. They'd given without expecting anything in return, and now the community was giving back in the same spirit. The mockery had transformed into something else: respect, gratitude, and a kind of love that expressed itself through action rather than words. If you've made it this far in Harold and Mabel's story, I want to thank you for staying with me. Before we see how their journey ends, would you take a moment to subscribe? Your support means more than you know. Now, let's continue. The letter arrived in February. Harold almost missed it among the bills and junk mail. A plain white envelope with an official-looking return address he didn't recognize. He opened it at the kitchen table while Mabel made lunch, expecting nothing in particular. What he found made him sit down hard. "Harold?" Mabel's voice was sharp with concern. "What is it? What's wrong?" He handed her the letter without speaking. She read it slowly, her lips moving slightly as she processed the words. "The University of Alaska," she said. "They want you to give a lecture?" "A series of lectures on traditional building techniques for extreme cold. They're calling it Indigenous Knowledge Preservation." Harold shook his head in disbelief. "They want to pay me," Mabel, $2,000. Mabel sat down across from him, still holding the letter. How did they even hear about you? Dr. Chen, has to be. She was talking about writing things down, making it official. She must have contacted them. They sat in silence for a moment, the letter between them like something precious and fragile. Are you going to do it? Mabel asked. Harold thought about standing in front of a classroom full of young people, trying to explain things he'd learned from his grandmother and his father and decades of living close to the edge of survival. The idea terrified him. He'd never been comfortable with words, had never thought of himself as someone with knowledge worth sharing. But then he thought about the cold snap, about 32 people in his cabin, about little Emma breathing steam from Mullen tea, about Carl Hendricks building a wall with his own hands because Harold had taught him how. Yes, he said, I'm going to do it. The first lecture was scheduled for March. Harold spent weeks preparing, writing notes on index cards, practicing in front of Mabel until she could recite his main points from memory. He drew diagrams, made models, gathered samples of the materials he'd used in his double wall. By the time the day arrived, he'd never been more nervous or more ready. The lecture hall at the University of Alaska Fairbanks held 200 people. Every seat was filled. Harold stood at the podium, looking out at faces young and old, students and professors and community members who had driven hours to hear him speak. His hands trembled slightly as he shuffled his index cards, but when he opened his mouth, the words came out steady. My name is Harold Jensen, he said. I'm 73 years old, and 2 months ago I almost froze to death in my cabin 11 miles outside of Fairbanks. But I didn't. None of us did. And I'm here to tell you why. He talked for 2 hours. He explained the physics of heat transfer and the principle of dead air. He showed them how to build a double wall with nothing but salvage lumber and natural materials. He shared his grandmother's remedies and his father's techniques and everything he'd learned in 50 years of Alaska winters. But mostly, he told stories about the night the cold came, about the people who crowded into his cabin, about Carl Hendricks, who had mocked him and then asked to learn, about little Emma, breathing steam in the lamplight, about Mabel, who had believed in him when no one else did. When he finished, the audience sat in silence for a long moment. Then someone started clapping, and the sound spread until the whole room was on its feet, applauding an old man who had never thought he had anything worth teaching. Afterward, a young woman approached him with tears in her eyes. My grandfather built like you do, she said. Same techniques. I thought that knowledge died with him, but you're keeping it alive. Harold didn't know what to say, so he just took her hand and held it. The lectures continued through the spring. Harold gave talks at community centers, at village halls, at schools where children listened with wide eyes as he explained how their great-great-grandparents had survived without electricity or central round sane heating. He was interviewed by newspapers and radio stations. A documentary crew from Anchorage spent a week at his cabin, filming the double wall and asking questions about traditional building methods. Through it all, Mabel was by his side. Her health had improved since the cold snap, Dr. Chen said the activity and purpose had been better medicine than anything she could prescribe. The arthritis still bothered her on cold mornings, but she moved more easily now, smiled more readily, laughed more freely. You're famous, she told Harold one evening, showing him an article about his lectures that had appeared in the Fairbanks paper. I'm just a man who built a wall. You're a man who reminded people that they know more than they think, that the old ways aren't foolish, they're wisdom. She set down the newspaper and took his hand. You gave them hope, Harold. You can't put a price on that. He thought about the years before the cold snap, the isolation, the mockery, the slow, grinding poverty that had made every winter feel like a death sentence. He'd been invisible then, just an old man waiting to die in a cabin no one visited. Now he had purpose. Now he had community. Now he had something to leave behind. The summer brought changes Harold hadn't anticipated. The university offered him a permanent position, not as a professor, nothing that formal, but as a traditional knowledge consultant who would advise students and faculty on historical building techniques. The salary was modest, but it was enough to end the constant worry about money, enough to let him and Mabel live without fear of the next bill or the next winter. More importantly, it gave him a reason to keep going. He started working on a book, nothing fancy, just a practical guide to the techniques he'd spent his life learning. Dr. Chen helped him organize his thoughts, and a young graduate student named James volunteered to handle the writing and illustrations. They worked on it through the long summer days, sitting on Harold's porch while the midnight sun turned the sky gold. "This is going to help a lot of people," James said one evening, looking over their latest chapter. "That's the idea. Can I ask you something personal?" Harold nodded. "Why didn't you ever give up? All those years of people laughing at you, dismissing you. How did you keep going?" Harold considered the question. He thought about Mabel, about their small cabin, about the life they'd built together against all odds. "Because giving up means believing them," he said finally. "Believing that you're worthless, that your knowledge doesn't matter, that the world would be just fine without you. And maybe that's true for some people, but I decided a long time ago that it wasn't going to be true for me." James nodded slowly. "My grandmother used to say something like that. The only time you fail is when you stop trying. Smart woman, your grandmother." "She was." James smiled sadly. "She passed away last year. Never got to see me graduate." Harold reached over and put a hand on the young man's shoulder. "She sees you," he said. "They always do." The following winter arrived with the usual threats: early snow, plummeting temperatures, forecasts that made everyone nervous. But this year, things were different. Throughout Ridge Creek and beyond, double walls had gone up on dozens of homes. Some were built with Harold's direct guidance. Others followed the instructions he'd written out and shared freely with anyone who asked. The ugly duckling appearance of the structures, cabins wearing oversized coats, had become a point of pride rather than mockery. Jensen walls. People called them. Harold hated the name, but Mabel loved it. "Your grandfather would be so proud," she told him. "And your grandmother." They'd be bragging to everyone in heaven about their grandson, the famous builder. "I'm not famous. You're famous to the starred, people who matter." The first real cold snap of the season hit in late November. Temperatures dropped to 35 below zero, serious cold, though nothing like the previous year's record-breaking event. Harold watched the thermometer fall and felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the old anxiety that had been his constant companion for so many winters. But this year, something else happened. People called to check on them. Trucks stopped by with firewood, with food, with company. The isolation that had defined their lives for so long had been replaced by connection. They weren't invisible anymore. They weren't alone. On the anniversary of the Great Cold Snap, Ridge Creek held a community dinner. It was Carl Hendricks's idea, a way to honor what they'd survived and to celebrate the people who had saved them. The community center was decorated with photographs from that terrible week. The frozen trucks, the snow-buried houses, the grateful faces of people crowded into the Jensen cabin. Harold and Mabel were the guests of honor. They sat at a long table at the front of the room, surrounded by every person who had sheltered with them during the cold. Little Emma, now 7 years old and healthy, presented them with a handmade card. Her parents stood behind her, their eyes wet with gratitude. Carl Hendricks gave a speech, awkward and halting, but sincere. "A year ago, I thought Harold Jensen was a fool," he said. "I laughed at his wall. I said it would never work. I was wrong." He paused, collecting himself. "Harold and Mabel didn't just save our lives. They taught us how to save ourselves. They showed us that the old ways have value, that community matters, that kindness isn't weakness. It's the strongest thing there is." He raised his glass. "To Harold and Mabel Jensen, the best neighbors anyone could ask for." The room echoed with the toast, and Harold felt Mabel's hand slip into his. He looked at her, at the woman who had believed in him for 52 years, who had stood beside him through every hardship, who had helped him build something that would outlast them both. "I love you," he whispered. "I know," she whispered back. "I love you too." The book was published in the spring. It was called Building for Cold, Traditional Techniques for Extreme Weather. and it featured Harold's name on the cover alongside James's, who had done most of the actual writing. The publisher was a small university press that specialized in practical guides for rural living, but somehow the book found its way to people who needed it. Harold received letters from all over, from Alaska, from Canada, from Scandinavia and Russia, and anywhere else the cold was a serious threat. People sent photographs of double walls they'd built using his instructions, stories of winters they'd survived because of techniques they'd learned from his book. One letter came from a village in northern Finland, written by an elderly woman who said the book had reminded her of her grandmother's teaching. "We had forgotten," she wrote. "Your book helped us remember." Harold kept that letter in his desk, taking it out when he needed to remember why the work mattered. "Thank you for staying with me through Harold and Mabel's story. If it's touched your heart, I'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs to hear it today." Now, let me tell you how their story ends. The following year, when Harold was 75 and Mabel was 73, they celebrated their 54th wedding anniversary. It wasn't a big celebration, just a dinner at home with close friends. The kind of gathering that would have been unthinkable a few years earlier when they'd had no friends to speak of. Carl and his wife came, and Dr. Chen and James, the graduate student, and a dozen others who had become part of their extended family. After dinner, Harold and Mabel sat on their porch, wrapped in blankets against the October chill. The double wall rose around them, solid and reliable, a barrier against the cold that would protect them for as long as they needed protecting. "Do you remember what you said to me?" Mabel asked. "The day you decided to build the wall?" Harold thought back to that morning, 2 years ago now, when he'd been sitting at the kitchen table with a pencil stub and the back of an envelope, trying to figure out how to survive another winter. "I said it was our best chance. You said home isn't a place. It's what we build together," Mabel smiled. "You were right about all of it." Harold looked at the woman he'd loved for more than half a century, at the cabin he'd built with his own hands, at the wall that had saved them and everyone around them, at the life they'd created against all odds. "I was scared," he admitted, "every day. Scared it wouldn't work, scared we'd lose everything. But you did it anyway. What choice did I have? The cold doesn't care if you're scared. It just does what it does. All you can control is yourself." They sat in silence as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The temperature was dropping, the first hint of the winter to come. But Harold wasn't worried. The wall would hold. The community would help. They would survive. They always had. Harold Jensen passed away peacefully in his sleep on a March morning, 3 years after the great cold snap that made him famous. He was 77 years old. Mabel found him when she woke, still warm, still peaceful, still holding her hand the way he'd held it every night for 56 years. The doctor said his heart had simply stopped, the way hearts do when they've done all the beating they were meant to do. The funeral was the largest Ridge Creek had ever seen. People came from all over, from Fairbanks and Anchorage, from villages throughout the interior, from places Harold had never visited but had touched anyway through his book and his lectures, and his quiet insistence that the old ways mattered. They stood in the snow outside the community center because there wasn't room for everyone inside. Carl Hendricks gave the eulogy. He talked about the double wall and the cold snap, and the night 32 people had crowded into a tiny cabin because one stubborn old man had refused to give up. He talked about what it meant to be wrong about someone and what it meant to learn. Harold Jensen wasn't famous because he built a wall, Carl said. He was famous because he built a community, because he took people who had laughed at him and taught them anyway, because he understood something most of us forget, that we survive together or we don't survive at all. Mabel sat in the front row, dry-eyed and proud. She'd cried plenty in the days since Harold's death, but today wasn't for crying. Today was for remembering, for celebrating, for honoring the man who had loved her completely and taught her that love could build something that would last forever. The cabin still stands. Mabel lived there for another 4 years after Harold's death, looked after by the community that had become her family. When she finally passed, peacefully, in the same bed where Harold had died, holding the hand of a neighbor who had become like a daughter to her, She left the property to the university. It's a museum now, a teaching center, a place where people come to learn the old ways that Harold preserved and shared. The double wall has been restored and maintained, and every winter it demonstrates the same simple truth it demonstrated during the Great Cold Snap. That dead air doesn't move, that barriers don't have to be fancy to be effective, that survival is possible if you understand how things work. Inside the cabin, everything is as Harold and Mabel left it. The wood stove they tended together for 50 years, the chairs where they sat during the longest night, the kitchen table where Harold first sketched his plans for the wall that would save them all. On that table, preserved under glass, is the envelope where Harold did his original calculations. You can still see the pencil marks, the numbers that told him they wouldn't make it through the winter. And next to those numbers in different pencil, the words he wrote when he decided to try anyway. Build the wall. Don't give up. Visitors come from all over the world to see those words. Students and researchers, architects and builders, anyone who wants to understand how one ordinary man in an extraordinary situation found a way to survive. But mostly, the people who visit are like Harold and Mabel were, regular folks facing hard times, looking for hope in a world that often seems determined to freeze them out. They stand in that small cabin, surrounded by the walls that kept the cold at bay, and they read those 5 words, build the wall. Don't give up. And something shifts in them. Something wakes up. They walk out of that cabin believing that maybe, just maybe, they can survive too. That's Harold Jensen's legacy. Not the wall itself, though the wall still stands. Not the book, though the book is still read. Not the lectures or the awards or the articles written about him. His legacy is the people who learned from him, the walls they built, the winters they survived, the knowledge they passed on to their children and their children's children. His legacy is the truth he lived by every day of his 77 years. That the cold doesn't care if you're scared, that giving up means believing the people who said you couldn't do it, and that sometimes the person everyone dismisses is the only one who really understands how to survive. The last time anyone saw Mabel Jensen smile was 3 days before she died. A young woman had come to the cabin, a graduate student writing a thesis on traditional building techniques. She'd traveled all the way from Norway following the trail of knowledge back to its source. She sat at Mabel's bedside, asking questions about Harold, about the wall, about the night that changed everything. "What do you want people to remember about him?" the young woman asked. Mabel was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the wall Harold had built. Then she smiled, that same sharp, knowing smile she'd given Harold on their wedding day, and every day after. "Remember that he was kind," she said. "Remember that he was stubborn. Remember that when everyone said it couldn't be done, he did it anyway." She turned to look at the young woman, her blue eyes still bright after 81 years. "And remember that the warmest place in the world isn't the place with the best heating. It's the place where someone loves you enough to try." The young woman wrote those words down. She included them in her thesis, which became a book which was translated into 14 languages and read by millions of people who would never see Alaska but who understood exactly what Mabel meant. The warmest place in the world is the place where someone loves you enough to try. That's what Harold and Mabel built together. Not just a wall, not just a cabin, a truth that outlasted them both. And in the end, that's all any of us can hope to leave behind. Thank you for listening to Harold and Mabel's story. If it meant something to you, I hope you'll carry a piece of it with you and maybe share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Until next time, stay warm, stay kind, and never give up.